For everything there is a season, a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what has been planted. Long, long ago, by the banks of the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers that flow through the deserts of Babylon, there were farmers planting crops of wheat. And the soil along the river bank was rich, and the sun in the deserts of Babylon was strong, and the water from the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed sweet and ensured that the wheat would never become dry and parched. The only problem was that in the spring the snows in the mountains would melt and the water would come rushing down the river, and the rivers would flood and destroy any crops planted along their banks. If the farmers sowed their crops too early, they would be washed away in the spring flood. But if they left them too late, then they would lose valuable growing time and they would curse their luck. So they needed a way of knowing. They needed a way of understanding what God was doing to them. What was the right time of year to sow the crops? And when they looked up into the night sky and they saw the stars and the moon, they noticed that the moon would gradually change so that it was never in quite the same place from one night to another. And this was curious, and so they started to keep records of what the moon looked like from night to night. And they would notice that after a period of 29 nights or so, the moon would be the way it was at the start of that period, and it would start the whole cycle again. And they realized that in this way they could divide a year into months, and they could mark the progress through each month from night to night. And in this way they could give each night in the year its own special name. And once they had done that, they could record each year the night before the floods and the night when the flood waters went down. And so they began to watch for patterns that are things that happen the same every year. And once they understood the pattern, they could predict when the floods would come and when the flood waters would go down. And they could say with some certainty the right day to plant the crops. And they began to understand that God had made the world with patterns in it, so that you cannot see straight away, but when you notice these patterns, you can see how people can understand the creation that God has given to them. And all this was difficult work. You had to watch the night sky very patiently. You had to record everything you saw. You had to compare your records with the records that had been kept by others before you. It was difficult work, but it was important work. And the men who did it were called Magi, and their wisdom was respected far and wide by farmer and king alike. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up. When the farmers understood when they should plant their crops to make best use of the floodwaters of the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers, their crops grew plentifully, and the land along the mighty rivers became renowned for the wealth of those farmers. And their wealth attracted all sorts of bandits and kings who would come riding down from their hills with their chariots and their armies to conquer this rich land and take it for themselves. And so the farmers found themselves working the rich land for the benefits of these bandits who called themselves emperors, these tyrants who called themselves kings. And just as they were getting used to one emperor, some other bandit would come down from the hills and defeat that emperor and take the land and declare themselves emperor. And when they declared themselves emperor, these bandits would say that God himself had given them this victory. And who could argue? After all, they were victorious. Was it true that the same God who would make the river waters rise and flood the land and make it plentiful, also sent these rulers down from the hills to take the very produce that the rich soil had given? And if the same God who made the moon change every night in the night sky to tell the people when the river would flood, was also sending these bandits down from the hills to become emperors, was it not possible that this same God was in some way telling the people what he was going to do next? Was there a way of looking at the night sky and predicting when the next wave of chariots and armies might descend on those people, growing their crops by the mighty river? And so the Magi began to watch the stars more carefully and record how they changed their position. And they soon noticed very slowly that some of the stars were indeed moving around the night sky, and you could spot their movements if you were patient and recorded everything and compared your records with the records of those that had been kept before you. And they began to wonder what these things might mean. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. One of those Magi was a young man called Melchior. He was good at his work. He was very hard-working. He was respected by the other Magi. He specialized in stars and watched their movements and recorded them every night. And his fame grew far and wide, and other wise men from other nearby countries who were also watchers of the night sky would write to him, and he would write letters back. And so he became very friendly with two other wise men, Caspar from India and Balthazar from Arabia. And pretty soon the letters that they were sending to and fro between each other were all about the same thing. A bright new star was rising in the sky. What did it mean? They consulted the ancient records and they came to the same conclusion. This star was like other stars that had been seen in ancient times, and those stars all meant the same thing. A new king had been born. A new conqueror was coming. He was coming to take the lands along the mighty rivers. God was sending him. But this star was bigger than the other stars had ever been. It would be useless to resist the power of this new king that God was sending. And Melchior and Caspar and Balthazar, in their letters, became very concerned. And they came to an agreement. They would journey to the west, where it seemed this star was leading them, and they would find this king, and they would pay homage to him, and they would bring him gifts, so that when God sent him as the irresistible conqueror, he would look favourably on them and on their neighbours in the lands where they lived. And so they set off together, following the star, and they came to the land of Judea. And when they arrived in Judea, they felt certain that this was the land where the king had been born, and so they went to find the king and went to the palace in the main city called Jerusalem, because everybody knows that kings live in palaces in the big cities. And the palace that they went to happened to be the palace of a man called King Herod, who was the king of Judea at that time. And he was a cunning and evil man. Now the wise men, they were not cunning. Their wisdom lay in the truth that they found in the night sky, and not in the petty affairs of human beings. So they went to the palace, and without thinking what effect their words might have, they simply said that we have come to pay homage to the new mighty king who has been born. But nobody had been born in the palace. Which king do you mean? Asked Herod, and gazed around him. The king who will be a mighty conqueror, the king who has been sent by God, said Melchior. What does this mean? Herod asked his own wise men. Well, his wise men didn't watch the night skies. They had no use for that kind of learning. They searched for wisdom in ancient books containing stories and histories and prophecies. And so when Herod asked them where the king was that God was sending, where this king was to be born, they answered, well, in the books it says that this king will be born in Bethlehem. And they said this in front of everybody in the palace, and Herod became very angry, and he sent all the wise men away and had a big sulk. But that evening he sent word to Melchior and his friends to come and see him in secret in the palace. And he said to them, I want you to go to Bethlehem and find this king. And when you found him, come back to me and tell me where he is, because I too would like to go and pay homage to this king whom God has sent. But it was a lie. In truth, Herod planned to send his soldiers to kill the boy who had been born to be king, so that no king would grow up and replace him, King Herod, king of Judea. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away. So Melchior and his friends went to Bethlehem. It was a tiny place, not very far from Jerusalem, and they soon arrived, and they asked around, was there a baby that had been born with something maybe a little bit special about it? Was there a special baby that had been born? And the people of Bethlehem all gave the same answer. Well, you need to go and visit the place where, and they pointed out the place where Mary was with Joseph and the newborn baby. Well, it was no palace. Could this really be a king? Where were the chariots? Where were the armies of soldiers? How could this little baby conquer the world? And yet this was where the star had brought them. And Melchior and Caspar and Balthazar trusted the stars. And so they knelt before this baby boy and they gave him their valuable presents. And afterwards they spent the night in Bethlehem, and they all had the same dream as they slept. In their dream they saw stars, of course, but the stars were behaving strangely. Some moved slowly, others moved at high speed. Some stars seemed to overpower and gobble up other stars, and other stars moved in ways that they had never seen stars move before. And when they awoke the next morning, they told each other about their dreams. How strange that they should all have the same dream. What was God telling them in this dream? It was Melchior who worked it out. There is danger. That is why some stars are gobbling up other stars. We must return home, but not the way we came. That is why the stars are moving in our dreams in ways we have never seen them move before. And so they resolved to return home by another road. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to seek, and a time to lose. a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Melchior returned home, and the years passed. Melchior became an old man. He had young men working for him, and he taught them all he knew, and they took over stargazing as his eyes faded and he could no longer see clearly. The young stargazers had so much respect for Melchior. He had so much wisdom, and they would tell him what they had seen in the stars, and they would ask his opinion about what it might mean. Some of them knew the story of how he had travelled to Judea following a very special star, and how he had gone to a palace and spoken to a King Herod, how he had found his way to a tiny village called Bethlehem, and a little boy born in a very poor place. At first Melchior really believed that this poor little boy would grow up to be a king, and one day he would sweep into Babylon with his armies and his chariots and conquer the lands along the mighty rivers. And he, Melchior, would come and say, "Do you remember me? I came to visit you. I came to see you when you were a tiny baby in Bethlehem." But as the years passed, he began to wonder whether maybe he got it all wrong. Maybe he got the wrong boy. Maybe the star meant something completely different and the whole journey had been a waste of time. And Melchior became very old. And when he was old and close to death, the young stargazers looked after him. They gave him a bed in a room that he could lie on. The room had a window that allowed him to see the willow trees along the mighty river bank. And one day, Melchior was lying on his bed, drifting in and out of sleep. He could see the willow branches moving rhythmically in the breeze. He could hear the sounds of people chatting in the streets below. And then he began to focus on one particular voice, the voice of a particular man. He was speaking Melchior's language, but he was clearly a foreigner. You could tell that by his accent. What was it that he was saying? And suddenly some of the words became very clear. The man was saying, "My Lord said, I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone belongs to the truth who listens to my voice." And Melchior started suddenly. "He has sent his messenger," he murmured. "The king is on his way." And then he sighed, and he breathed his last breath, and Melchior died. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven.